Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my NACL week number 5 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. We are over halfway through with the regular season already. We have a really good idea of where a lot of these teams are going to be sitting, of course, with single round robin, even with a lot of these being, very important best of threes that you can clearly tell these teams are taking seriously. It is definitely a bit difficult to get a 100% kind of picture on any of these teams, but for the most part, we definitely have a better idea of where everybody is sitting heading into the back half of the year. I'm excited to go over everything. If you want to know my thoughts on what we've had leading up to this week, you can check out the playlist up in the iCard right now. That's every single week of the NACL overviewed in the same fashion on this channel. This is the final, I guess, money week, the super week, if you will, of the regular season here. That means there's going to be 3 days of action instead of 2, and that means we've got some money matches to talk about, so I'll definitely be highlighting those as we get into them. But again, every match kind of matters here in the regular season. You just don't want to be bottom 2, and right now that's definitely a bit of a race, so we'll go ahead and talk about it more as we move along, but hope you guys are excited. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is we're going to go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover, and at the end of the video, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10 at the end of the week to kind of show you guys where I think teams are moving in terms of maybe they're getting better, maybe they're getting worse, maybe expectations are getting higher, etc., etc. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning of the video. Let's start off with day number 1. Unlike last week, we only have 2 series on day number 1, 8 series across the week as a whole, and kicking off the first day here is a matchup between Disguised and CCG Esports. That DSG is going to pick up a pretty convincing 2-0 win in. This is pretty major. DSG obviously is pretty historically looked inconsistent, we'll just say, with this roster, both in spring and in summer, regardless of the changes that they've ended up making. This team is yet to be able to find its footing in terms of being able to beat good teams consistently really at all, but we know that the upside is there. We know that the highs are there, and I continue to really value one of these players incredibly highly, and that is Tomo, my player of the series. Once again here, I will continue to go on record and say that Tomo is just too good for the NACL. I think he has proven that, not only over the course of this summer split where he's been kind of dragging DSG across the finish line in a lot of these series. This was definitely a little bit less than that. I don't want people to get the interpretation that I'm trying to say that he was the only player who played well in this series, but as we've seen in previous series, he's definitely been the one to kind of push them over the top in other circumstances. But go back to spring, go back to his time on Dignitas where he was honestly really good. There was a real lack of consistent AD carry talent in the LCS in the spring split, especially in terms of the 2v2 laning phase, where I just didn't feel like there were a lot of people actually trying to win it other than Yon and Core JJ. They were the only bot lane that was actually going out and winning early. Tomo was one of the few AD carries that was actually trying to contest that, and he was an all-pro caliber player for me in the spring split, if only just because a lot of the other AD carries in North America really didn't play well, and so for him to come back down here to the NACL, it's not surprising to see him do as well as he is doing right now. He's got those aggressive tendencies, he's got the mechanical skill to back it up, he's done really well at this level before. It's really not surprising to see him continue to be such a positive figure for DSG, and quite frankly, he is clearly the best player on this team at the moment. Now, again, it wasn't just him. He was awesome in game number 2 on the Ezreal, was definitely the focal point for where they wanted to put their mid-game pressure, and I do think that his positioning was really good in this series, even if his early games, ironically enough, weren't actually all that perfect, but he wasn't the only one who played well. Young was really good here in the mid lane. That's something that I think just needs to get more consistent. I like Young. I've always liked Young. I was really high on him when he was on Golden Guardians Challengers, a couple of years ago. I was really kind of, I guess, pounding the table is probably the phrase I'd use for Young. You can go back and check the logs on that on this channel, but he just has not been able to take that next step into being one of the best mid laners in the NACL. I think he is clearly one of the more interesting ones. Like, he's somewhere in that, like, 3, 5, 6 range, you know what I mean? Somewhere in that, cluster of players who are very good and will win you games, but aren't going to be, like, dominant in the same way that we saw it of someone like Quad, or that at times someone like Roamer offers. Spyrax, in my opinion, is in that conversation. So, we've been just kind of waiting for that. I think we are getting closer to that. Hopefully, the Tristana was awesome in game number 1. A billion damage, was super consistent. They played through him. That's what I want to see more of. I don't want to see him playing super passive. That's something that he has fallen into a bit in terms of traps. I think Yukino was a lot better in this series. He's definitely been hit or miss over the course of this split. I'm a big fan of Tenacity. I think people criticize him too heavily. Crimson was actually really good on the other side. Crimson has really found his form for CCG. We will talk about that when we get into that team, but, you know, Poom, I think, is still trying to find his form. He's still trying to find his consistency. Very different style to what he was playing with Manui last split. You know, he's obviously played with Tomo before, but I think it's definitely an adjustment period, and there have been times where he has been very out of position and making very critical errors, but there have also been some amazing engages, and I think generally this series was much more of a positive than it was a negative. Overall, I like DSG. I'm just worried about, like, them on any given series. I think they can beat basically anybody, and if they go into playoffs and pull off what they did last split, where they're just a lower seeded team that ends up running the table early on and beating really good teams and getting top 3 or top 4, I'm not going to be all that surprised. The problem is, it's really hard to predict DSG win any series because of their inconsistencies. But for CCG, on the other side, we just know who they are at this point. Their schedule's been relatively tough, but they've taken care of the games that they are supposed to take care of, and they've lost to the teams that they are supposed to lose to. To me, they are the most clear team in terms of what they are in the NACL right now. They are the team that is going to firmly be in number 7. I think when they play the other bottom, you know, teams that are kind of competing to not be in the bottom 2, I think they're probably going to be better than those teams. But when they're facing a team like DSG that just has more mechanical upside than them right now, I think they're just going to lose. Like, it really just is what it is. I like the players on this team. Unfortunately, I do have to give a dud of the series, and that is going to go to Chad. Just a really bad Lilia game in game number 2. He's been a bit hit or miss over the course of this split. I think generally Chad really struggles when he loses pressure early, and I think we saw that once again here. There are a lot of positives, though. I think the solo laners were generally fine. Shochi hasn't been quite as good as he has been in the past this split. A lot of that, I think, has to do with the fact that his team just isn't as good in the early game, but part of it is him not being as dominant in the 1v1s. One of the reasons that I was really high on Shochi individually as a player is it felt like he made his jungler's life a lot easier in every situation that he was in because he is so good at establishing pressure in the middle of the map. That hasn't been happening nearly as consistently in this meta, just something to note. But Crimson's really found his form. I think he was struggling a bit in the first, like, week or two of the NACL, but it's his first split here. I think the more time he has played, the better it has gotten. Obviously, the scorelines look good. I still want to see him have more of an impact in the late game. That's something that I think he has struggled a bit more on, is turning that gold into actual effective results on the Rift, but he's doing a lot more than other players at his position right now, which is consistently generating gold, and that's just not something that I think a lot of people are able to do even with resources at the moment. Manui and Trevor had good moments, they had bad moments. You know, Lissandra, I think, is something that really can work in the support position, especially in Fearless when you don't have nearly as many options, but Tomo and Poom were definitely better on the day in terms of the bot lane. Generally, CCG just is what they are. They're going to be a team that probably finishes 7th, and they're going to lose to the teams in the top 6. They're probably going to beat the teams in the bottom 3, and they're probably just going to have to live with that in terms of, you know, the output that they're putting out. But for DSG on the other side, hopefully they can start building upon this. They're above 500 now. They're at 500 in terms of game score. This is a good position in terms of their record and in terms of just overall the vibe surrounding this team, but they can't take this and turn this into a random loss later in the week or a random loss next week. That's what's really been holding DSG back, is their lack of ability to string together these wins rather than have them sporadically throughout the year. And so hopefully for DSG, this is a sign of good things to come. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1 here, and it is a very interesting top of the table clash between FlyQuest Challengers and Fear x Starforge that FlyQuest is going to pick up a win in. This was a close series, Fear taking a pretty decisive game number 1, pretty slow, pretty calm, pretty collected. They were able to get a big fight at the end, and quite frankly, just end it from there. Instinct gets his penta, and it looks all good, but games 2 and 3, definitely a little bit, I don't want to say sloppier, like that's not a fair way to put it, but definitely a little bit more chaotic in terms of how the games go down, and Fly ends up thriving a bit more in that environment, unfortunately, and they're able to pull out the games 2 and 3 wins, and they're able to walk out of this series with another victory. They continue to keep themselves at the top of the standings. They have yet to drop a series after losing to Dragonsteel at the start of the year, which is a good sign. They've not exactly looked nearly as dominant as they did in the spring split, obviously, as the defending champions, but they still look pretty darn good, and I think that there are a couple of players that definitely deserve some shout-outs. Player of the series for me is going to go to Shaden in the jungle. That Viego game in particular in game number 2 is kind of what won them this series. They were in a bad state in game number 2. Blaze Olive was super fed. head on the Hui, and that was a really good spot for them to be in. You had the Sejuani to try and set it up. Philip was on Cassante. Like, you had real damage, and honestly, you probably should have been able to close out that game, but Shaden really started getting those resets and really started taking over on the Viego, even after everything that happened in the top lane with Surdy's Kennen really not being all that useful. Shaden saved game number 2 and carried it, in my opinion, and then in game 3, it was a bit more of a team effort. They were able to just kind of hang on a bit more, calm, cool, and collected, and then kind of destroy that, but Shaden really was the one that won this series for them for me, and I think Shaden continues to be a weird one to try to evaluate, because when you look at him individually as a player, he is so flippy, and I think he does, you know, I agree with a lot of the people that say he looks better because he's on this team, because he gets to play with Surdy and Sajed and Chime and Bradley, and, you know, a lot of these really good lanes, and I think generally in a worse situation, he would look worse. Like, if he was on a bad team in the NACL or in the LCS or something like that, I don't think he would look nearly as good. I just don't think he's the kind of player to elevate a bad team in that kind of way, but man, when things work out, they really work out. I'm just a bit worried about, like, the play style, but somehow along the way, I think we've lost sight of just how mechanically talented he is, and so I want to try to find a middle ground in terms of the narratives that I think are being pushed on him. He is one of the best junglers in the NACL, one of the most promising prospects, because I think if you put him around good talent in the LCS right now, he could be a difference maker. He is talented enough to do that. I think Chime is also just ridiculous. I mean, an absolute masterclass in game 3 on the Rakan. This guy is just unbelievably good. The fact that he is not in the LCS is honestly absurd, because he is way too good for the NACL, and I love the NACL, but he should not be in tier 2 in any region. Like, he is that good right now. I know it's his last split. I know he's not going to be playing going into next year, but it's just unfortunate because I think this guy would be a really big difference maker at the LCS level, quite frankly, with how inconsistent a lot of the supports there have been. I think Chime would very much be somebody that could come in and stabilize for a majority of teams right now in the LCS. He is unbelievable. Sajed obviously benefits from that, but he is really good in terms of his positioning. He plays his role within this team really well, and I think that that's a big positive. I think Surdy was awesome in that final game, game number 3 on the Aatrox. Obviously, that's the one people are going to be pointing to. Wasn't quite as good at the beginning of the series, and so I couldn't quite give him player of the series for that, but obviously I love Surdy. And then Bradley continues to be solid. I think ABO was also very good, at least in the beginning part of this series on the other side of this matchup, but Bradley definitely did his job on the LeBlanc in game number 3, which is really kind of the important one that he needed to do. So overall, I feel good about FlyQuest. Maybe not quite as good as I did in the spring split, because again, they're just not quite as dominant, but they still look very good, and so it's hard to really, you know, nitpick and criticize them at the moment. But for Fear, this is a very good team. I know I dropped them to number 5 in my power rankings last week, but again, that was mostly because Supernova and Team Liquid just looked so good. I think all of those teams are all in one big cluster at the top of the standings right now, fighting it out to try and get into the top 2, and Fear is very much still a part of that. This was a good showing for them overall. They showed they could compete with one of the best teams in the league, the defending champions, and I think that that is a good sign. Unfortunately, they just couldn't quite close things out after the game 1 win. Winsome is unfortunately going to get my dud of the series. I just didn't think he was all that effective in the back half here. The Rel really in particular just didn't really do anything. The Thresh wasn't nearly as, like, bad, but it also wasn't good. Like, it didn't really do a whole ton. You just want to see him be more impactful on the game overall, and especially with Chime being so influential for FlyQuest on the other side, it was more noticeable that Winsome was probably the worst support in this series. And then Ablaze Olive was really good in game number 2 on the Hui. We talked about that before, but was really bad on the Galio in game number 3. You know, very much considered him for dead of the series for how ineffective that pick was. You know, trying to, you know, overcook in this draft with the Lee Sin top, the Kha'Zix in the jungle, the Galio in the mid lane. Like, I understand the idea behind a lot of these picks, but it ended up really not working out, and ABO getting really far behind in the mid lane ended up really hurting Fear. So that's something to point out. Philip, I think, was also definitely worse in that game number 3. I like Lee Sin top. I think generally it's been something that I've advocated for a lot on this channel. I think it's a pick that is generally underutilized globally. Every single time that we see it, oftentimes it does end up working out, but maybe not with this collection of, you know, teammates. Kha'Zix jungle is not something that I think is really all that good right now, and Galio is really not good in my opinion in terms of the numbers, and Thresh is obviously low in terms of the numbers. I just think you drafted a little bit too much spice in game number 3, and it kind of put you back in that respect, but overall, I think this team is still fine, and I would expect them to continue to be able to make a run. Like, again, this could be a top 3 team even with this loss. I feel pretty good about that. It's just really hard to distinguish between the really good teams right now in the NACL because they are all really solid. And then for Fly on the other side, like I said, this is going to still be a team that competes to be the best in the NACL. Dragonsteel feels like they have a pretty strong grasp of that number 1 spot, especially after beating Fly earlier in the year, but anything can happen in the playoffs, and this team has already shown that they can step up when it matters most. And then moving on now into day number 2, and of course day 2 is the start of our money matches, and so I'm excited to talk about these, but Fear won't have long to see their second game of the week as they're jumping right into it. It's Winthrop University taking on Fear x Starforge, and Fear is going to pick up a win in this one. It's very funny when we get to talk about teams in back-to-back series. It's just kind of how it ended up working here at the end of day 1 and at the beginning of day 2, but Fear quickly gets back on track in terms of how they end up winning this, although it wasn't quite as clean as a 2-0 would necessarily indicate. They ended up having to do some interesting things to end game number 2, basically bait all of Winthrop to go after the Elder Dragon and then just kind of backdoor them or, base race them or however you want to phrase it. It was a very funny game. They end up winning game number 2 down gold, like even after the Nexus explodes, which is never really, a good indicator that you dominated or anything like that, but at the end of the day, 2 wins is 2 wins, and you're definitely going to take that. For Winthrop, they continue to look pretty good. It's really hard to get a good idea of this team because they look really good in such small sample sizes. I do think that this team is very competitive, and I think that is very likely that they are going to be pretty clear of bottom 2. Right now I still have them there in terms of my power rankings, but every single week they show me why that is a ridiculous thing to continue to have. Hopefully they can keep overperforming the expectations. Worth noting, new top laner in here, Decoy was playing this week. I don't know if that's going to be something that continues, but he was generally fine in this series, and so we'll talk about him, as if he was the top laner and as if he will continue to be the top laner for this team over Denethor. But let's talk about Fear first and foremost. Player of the series for me is going to go to Instinct down in the bot lane, mostly for Zeri, but the Ziggs game was also really good. Like, he was probably the most important and the best player on this team in both of their games in this series, and that's just a really big thing to be able to say. I think Instinct's been really good. I didn't know exactly what we were going to get out of Instinct coming into the split. He was the player on this team that I was not the most concerned about, because I wasn't concerned that he would be bad, but just he had the most question marks about him on Fear, in my opinion, coming into the split, because the last time we saw him in the NACL, he was on FlyFam, and things just weren't really working out at all. That team just wasn't very good, and so you didn't really know what you were going to get from him. He was really good in the qualifiers with CCG, and so you felt pretty good about that, and obviously he's been good at the LCS level in the past for TSM, so, he has some experience, doing well at a high level of competition, but it just was a question about whether or not he was going to be able to keep up, not only with, being good in the NACL, but being good enough for what Fear is anticipating they're going to be, which is a top 2 to 3 team in the NACL. So far, he has lived up to the billing. He has been able to be a primary carry for this team, and I think that is a major positive overall. I was really, really impressed with him. He was the best player in this series by a large margin. I think Winsome also played significantly better than he did in day number 1. I think the Nautilus and the Rakan both were very strong in terms of his ability to control pacing in the game and to just create the opportunities that he wanted to create rather than waiting for the opportunities that kind of presented themselves to him. It was a really good thing from the bot lane, and it's nice to see them both playing well. I think Ablaze Olive continues to not be a problem, although I do want to see him be a little bit more aggressive in terms of how he plays some of these mid lane matchups. Darkwings at times was better in this series, especially on the MF in game number 2, which is obviously something we will talk about when we get to Winthrop, but Philip, XU also looking solid. XU in particular, I think, was underratedly good in this series. I think people are going to talk about how he was just kind of meh. I think he was actually pretty good here for Fear, but definitely the bot lane standing out most, and it's a nice win to get Fear back on the board. But for Winthrop, they definitely gave it a good shot in this one, and Fear is not a team you should feel bad about losing to, especially with how well you played the beginning of game number 2. I think there are a lot of good things to take away from this. Darkwings was awesome, and he's actually been really good across basically this entire split. Darkwings is one of those funny players, right? He started as a channel darling here in the NACL, somebody that I was really hyping up a lot when he was in the Dignitas system and, playing for them. And then, last year and, at the beginning of this year, I would say, things were just a little bit more up in the air in terms of, the consistency. I just wish he would be better on a game-to-game basis, because there are really good games, but there are also really bad games, and it's really hard to kind of buy into that as a top-tier mid laner at this level. He's starting to get that consistency back. It's not perfect, but his laning has gotten a lot better, I think, and that's really helped him out a lot. Hopefully that can keep up. Decoy, like I said, was pretty good up on the top side. Definitely interested to see where he ends up going and if they continue to end up playing him. Aaron, Winnie, Skytech, they were all fine. I do have to give a dead of the series, so it is going to go to Skytech for that Leona game in game number 1, where he was essentially just feeding kills to Zeri by the end of the game, but he was much better on the rel in game number 2. In fact, I really don't feel all that bad about Skytech coming out of this series. I think him and Aaron are still a pretty solid bot lane, and, Winthrop is still the team that we thought they were. They're going to be competitive. They're going to be difficult to take down. But unfortunately, they're just not good enough to beat Fear, who is one of the best teams in the league, despite their loss to Fly, who is also one of the best teams in the league earlier on in the week. So I don't feel bad at all about Winthrop losing this, and I feel good about Fear winning this. This is the outcome we expected, and it was a fun series to boot. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and this is a lot of people's series of the week right here in the middle. It's Team Liquid Challengers taking on Dragonsteel, and Dragonsteel will remain undefeated here as they move to 6-0, 12-2 to start the split. They have just been on fire. Everything is clicking for this team, even when they're at major disadvantages in the games that they play, like they were in this one, where they're down like 8k gold in game number 2, where they're not dominating game number 1. It never really feels like they're out. It never feels like they could ever lose these games. And I know that feels like a weird thing to say, but even with Team Liquid doing so well, it's just so hard to look at Dragonsteel as anything other than the favorite. It's really crazy to see how things end up transpiring, but Dragonsteel is just that good. And Team Liquid, you know, credit to them. They really are one of the best teams in the NACL. I was right to move them up to top 3. This is, in my opinion, clearly a top 3 team in the NACL right now. You know, I really like Supernova, I really like Fear. I think those teams are very solid, but Team Liquid just has so much going for them in terms of how they're playing at the moment. They are significantly better than what they were in the spring split, and they already made top 3 in spring. I think they're going to do very well moving forward, so we'll have to see. But Dragonsteel is just on a bit of a different level from everybody else right now. Player of the series for me is once again going to go to Yuji. I've given him so many of these over the course of the split. This guy has just been dominant. I think he's even been better than he's getting credit for. He has been, in my opinion, the most valuable player to Dragonsteel, although I think it's close because Jerry has also been super good for them. But Yuji's ability to just generate pressure for this team, it's unparalleled, really, in terms of the other junglers in the league right now. The consistency with which he's able to do it is ridiculous. He is the best jungler in the NACL, and in my opinion, it's not even really all that close at the current moment. That's just how well he is playing. Obviously, the Karthus was notable in that first game for just the inevitability of it and the ability to just kind of get online and win the game and end it really fast once he was starting to get online. And then in game 2, I think he's going to get underestimated and underrated for how good that Sejuani game was. Maybe he wasn't quite as influential in game 2 as he was in the first game, but he was probably the most influential across both games in this series, which is, again, why he's getting player of the series. But Yuji is a frontrunner right now for MVP for me. Like, he is the guy to beat in terms of the MVP race, the most valuable prospect race. And golly, man, if he's not in the LCS soon, I'm gonna cry. Like, he is just way too good at this point. And then Jerry and Zyko are very close to being in that level as well. I think the only thing for Jerry and Zyko is they haven't done it for nearly as long. Yuji was doing this last year as well, and Jerry and Zyko have really emerged in 2024, but Jerry is awesome. Like, he is just so good. He has lived up to the hype and the expectations that we were talking about at the beginning of 2023 when he was coming up to Tier 2, where it's like, this guy is really, really good and could be able to make a big splash impact at this level basically immediately. It took a little bit of time, but man, he has transformed into probably the best AD carry, or at the very least, like, one of the best AD carries. He's right up there with, you know, people like Tomo and Instinct in terms of how they performed over the course of this year, and it's on any champion. You know, people who follow this channel know I'm a big fan of Jhin. I think Jhin is super undervalued in the meta right now. I see a lot of people still pretending and acting like it's the same meta where Jhin was a bad pick like 6 months ago. You know, Jhin was picked a lot last year and it didn't work, and it was picked a lot in spring, and, you know, people were right to complain about that. I was complaining about that because he wasn't exactly what the meta needed, but I think Jhin is in a much better spot with how the meta has shapen up over the course of the last few months, and I think Jhin is undervalued because of that, especially by the community as a whole. He's a different champion, and the game is a bit different now in terms of how you draft. I think Jhin has proven himself to be very valuable, but especially pairing him with something like Bard, I think you have so many options here for how you want to play this game. There's really not a way that you can't play this with something like an Ezreal mid or an Udyr top. Like, you have so many tools to be able to win fights. I think you could theoretically lack damage if things were to go really wrong, but even when you lost early, you were still able to win fights late because Jhin does a lot more damage and Ezreal does a lot more damage than people give them both credit for. Jerry and Zyko were both very good here. Spyrax was solid. Certainly had his own issues throughout times in this series, was certainly not perfect in game number 2, but, you know, he had some good plays as well, and Zamudo, definitely wanted to see him be a bit more consistent, but Yuji, Jerry, Zyko, they were all really good, and they definitely did more than enough to get Dragonsteel this win. For Team Liquid, you really pushed the best team in the league to their absolute limits, and that's all we can really ask for Team Liquid. You would have liked to maybe see them take a game, but they basically took, like, a game in total, because they won half a game in both games 1 and and 2, and so, you know, it's just kind of the way that it is, but they couldn't quite close anything out because Dragonsteel is really good in the back half of the game. Dud of the series was really difficult because of that, because everybody really kind of played well on Team Liquid. I actually considered giving Dud of the series to Spyrax, but I thought the game 1 was a little bit too good for me to even consider that. So Dud of the series is going to go to Kimdown over on the Rakan mostly here in game number 2, but the Nautilus in game number 1 not really ideal either. I honestly don't think Kimdown played all that bad. I think there was just somebody that had to get scapegoated, and he was the one to do it, because even if Jenkins really struggled in game 1 here, he was amazing in game number 2 on the Smolder, where he was the one kind of keeping them in it, and quite frankly, he should have won them that second game. Keel, Roamer, Spawn all kind of did their jobs. You know, Kimdown, for the most part, did his job as well. He was just the one that died the most, and so unfortunately, he's the one that gets the blame. It just kind of is what it is. I don't think Kimdown played poorly at all. I don't think anybody on Team Liquid really played poorly at all. I think this honestly reflects really positively on them. Dragonsteel is the best team in the league. They have proven that. 12-2 is a dominant record for this part of the season, and Team Liquid really did their absolute best to try to take some games off of them. I'm not going to be critical of that. I think they did a good job even if they didn't get the result that they wanted, and for Dragonsteel, they're just ridiculously good right now. They are the clear favorites to win the NACL, at least until something changes, and everything about this team really feels like the best in the entire league at this point. And then moving on to our third series of day number 2, and I said earlier that Team Liquid and Dragonsteel is the most hyped series of the week going into it. That is absolutely not the case. This is the most hyped series of the week going into it because of all of the trash talk and all of the publicity that has been around this matchup. We finally get to see it on the Rift. It's Supernova taking on Blue Otter, and Supernova is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. This isn't that surprising of an outcome on the Rift. Supernova is one of the best teams in the NACL. They are right there with Team Liquid and with FlyQuest and with Fear in terms of being able to fight for one of those top 2 spots. But the trash talk and just the overall social media presence of these two all week long, I mean, really, like for a while, multiple weeks now, has been crazy. And for this series to kind of, you know, go the way that it did, it's not all that surprising, again, in terms of the expectations of these teams. But I think some people were hoping for a bit more of a back and forth affair that we just didn't quite get. So we'll talk about it a little bit quickly here, because I don't think really there's a lot to talk about in terms of the substance of these games. There just really wasn't a lot going on, but player of the series for me is going to go to Faisal in the top lane. Faisal's awesome. You know, he is a player that I've really praised in the past. You know, his first split on Fear was one that I was calling like one of the best top laners in the league. And, you know, even if he had cooled down a bit ever since he left Fear and, you know, ever since he came over here to Supernova and even on Fly, I don't think he was quite as dominant. This is kind of the split that he's re-emerging as that potential number 1, number 2 top laner in the league for me. Number 1's a little bit hard to reach because of Surdy, but, you know, number 2 is very acquirable, and Faisal is very much in the conversation for that. He just has such a good mind. Like, his macro is so good, his micro is so good, his laning is obviously great, and his mechanics are obviously great, his ability to 1v1 is really solid, but he is the best split pusher in the NACL, and it's not even remotely close. He's just really good in that role, and we saw that on the Renekton in game 2, but he was super vital in game 1 on the Cassante as well. Just a great series overall from Faisal, and I think you could say the same for a lot of the rest of the team. Diamond is the other player that I really want to shout out. He is, at this point, become a channel darling. I think that's fair to say. I just constantly am hyping up how good Diamond is, because I don't think enough people are talking about just how good he is. I know he's had some bad LCS stints, but I think in the right circumstance with the right teammates around him, he could be very valuable to an LCS team, because he just continuously dominates tier 2. He's continuously one of the best supports at this level, and the Taric in game number 2 was excellent. It was game-shattering. Like, it really was that good, so worth pointing out. Len's obviously kind of the recipient of that. The Kalista was definitely better than the Jinx in game 1, but, you know, both games were really solid. Toasty was good. Kenvi was really good, especially on the Sejuani when he was able to capitalize on all of these lanes, doing something really aggressive. It's a very interesting draft, having the Kalista, Yone, Renekton to kind of pair up with the Sej plus Taric. It's a really interesting, like, fight combination, and, you know, having that Renekton in side lanes makes it more difficult to kind of focus on certain aspects of the game. It's a really interesting strategy here from Supernova, and it really ended up working out for them, but this really was all 5 players playing well. Faisal, definitely the standout. Diamond, definitely a standout for me as well in terms of individual performances, but Supernova just looking good. And for Blue Otter, it's unfortunate that it went this way with all the hype and just trash talk that was surrounding this series. I think, obviously, it would have been a little bit more ideal for these games to be a bit closer, but I don't think you're, like, frustrated if you're Otter that you lost this series. At least you probably shouldn't be. This is not a team that you should be expecting to beat at this level. I still think Blue Otter is a very strong candidate to not be in the bottom 2, but Supernova is just one of the best teams in the league. Again, they're in that big cluster of top 5 teams that I think are kind of just in their own little world right now. I think there are some concerns. Music was basically forced out of his own jungle in a majority of this series, specifically on the Viego in game number 2, where he just really wasn't allowed to do all that much. Quacker was definitely the worst of these two top laners. Faisal really dominated that 1v1 matchup, and I don't think Levitate and Rovex were really all that strong in terms of the bot lane matchup either. Rovex definitely a bit outplayed in that second game by Diamond, but Samakin continues to show some bright spots. I do want to see his macro improve a bit. He's a little bit more focused on being able to get resources for himself, and at least right now that's okay, because that's the direction that Blue should probably be heading in. He should be a primary carry for them, but I think moving into the future, if he does want to continue to grow as a player, I'd love to see some ability to kind of transition his early game pressure into mid game pressure a little bit cleaner, but you know, that's kind of nitpicking. He was definitely the strength of the team in this series, and overall, like I said, you know, Otter's going to be a little bit disappointed because of the hype around this series and because of the kind of significance of this matchup, but I think in terms of just on paper, what I expected to see from these two teams, this isn't really that shocking of an outcome. I still think Otter can be a really solid team even with this loss, and Supernova is just that good. I think that's a big reason for this, is I really just have a lot of faith in this Supernova team. As we saw last week, this team is really starting to find their groove, and I think this is a better version of what they were in spring. And then moving on to our third and final day of action here in Week 5 in the NACL, and we kicked it off with a very interesting upset as we saw FlyQuest Challengers taking on Disguised, and Disguised is going to pick up a very big 2-1 series win here. I did not see this coming. This was not one that I expected. You know, DSG has very much been a hit or miss team, but again, we've talked about this on the channel. When they hit, they really hit. When things work for this team, they really work, and they really worked in this series. There was a lot to like about DSG's play, especially in the back half here. You know, game 3, they were resilient. They stayed in the game regardless of how fed the Kai'Sa was getting on the other side of this matchup, and they tried to stay proactive, and they ended up having an easier to execute wombo combo at the end of the game with the Wukong Orianna, you know, adding on the Yasuo. Ziggs makes the game a lot easier. Just a lot of really easy pieces, and, you know, they end up pulling away in that circumstance, and for FlyQuest, you gotta feel pretty disappointed with this outcome. You are the defending champs, and you're sitting at 3-2 right now, just barely above 500, really not doing all that well in terms of the standings overall. You know, you haven't really had a ton of games. You are a little bit behind in terms of the rest of the teams around this level for how many games and series that you've played up until this point, and honestly, they've not looked nearly as dominant. There's been some good performances. I think there have been some good players for this team, but the consistency is certainly a lot lower, and I think the overall expectation for this team has clearly got to be a lot lower than it was in the spring split. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me was very difficult on the side of DSG, because I think there are multiple players that you have to point out as being really good for this team, but I'm going to give player of the series once again to Tomo down in the bot lane. It feels like I am sometimes praising Tomo a bit too much, and, you know, I try to be cognizant of that. I really don't want to sit here and have it seem like I'm trying to pretend that Tomo is the entirety of DSG and that they would be nothing without him, because I don't think that's true, but I do think that he is the most important player on this team. I do think that it is fair to say that they would be in a much worse position without someone like Tomo in the AD carry role. So, you know, it's important to try to find that nice balance in terms of talking about him, but he was awesome specifically on the Ziggs in game number 3, obviously led the game in damage. Might have been second to the Kai'Sa. I don't actually remember. It was AP Kai'Sa, and so, you know, you never really know, but he was definitely trading poke, and he was very valuable in that third and final game. I thought he was the most consistent in the first couple as well. When you're really looking at their 2 wins, games 2 and 3, who was the player that I thought was the most valuable in both? I think it was Tomo. I don't know if Tomo was the best player in either game, although I think it's very reasonable to give him player of the game for game number 3. I think it's really just up to your personal preference, but Yukino is definitely the other player that I really considered here for player of the series. Game 2 is obviously a massive draft gap. Like, the Camille, Lee Sin, you know, Syndra combo is very interesting, and I think it can do well in certain circumstances, but you gave over the strongest duo in the game in Zyra Corki right now, at least in terms of what we have seen globally. Not exactly sure how that's going to work as much at the NACL level, because games don't go typically as long in the NACL as they do in other regions. You know, a big reason why Zyra Corki is so difficult to deal with is because the inevitability of essentially trying to fight them 5v5 around objectives it makes it a lot more difficult, but It is kind of a bit of an Exodia draft at the moment, and Yukino, I think, piloted the Zyra, obviously, very well. And Young, I think, was the other player I considered. Was he the best player in Game 2? No, I would say Yukino was better. Was he the best player in Game 3? No, I would probably say Tomo was a bit better, but was he super consistent for both? Yes, and I think it's really nice to see Young have a very good week overall. Really nice to see that. Poom was very good. Tenacity was good. DSG just looked super solid in the back half of this series. Are there things that need to be cleaned up? Yes, but you just took down one of the best teams in the league, and you did it while feeling like the better team. This isn't like their win over Team Liquid, where, you know, I walked away being like, yeah, they won the series, but did they really? Like, they didn't feel like the better team. They kind of lucked out in being able to win that third and final game. I didn't feel that way here against FlyQuest. They were the better team in this series, and that is definitely encouraging. And for Fly, like, you kind of got 3-0'd. Like, there is a real argument to be made that, you know, Fly probably should have lost game number 1 as well, so long as DSG didn't randomly take that fight around Baron. I mean, they completely threw the game away, but outside of that, like, Fly didn't look great in this series, and there is a lot of fingers to point, I guess I will say. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Bradley. It's funny because I thought he played his best game in Game 3, and typically that will disqualify you from being dud of the series if you step up when it matters, but his games 1 and 2 were both kind of bad. Even Game 1, where they ended up winning, he was a bit of a problem in that game. He was definitely targetable on the way, and then in Game 2, he was really bad on the Syndra. He just was not useful at all, and quite frankly, Bradley's been a downgrade to Quad. There's really no other way to say it. He is the only change here, and I'm not trying to take a results-oriented approach. Just because this team is worse now that Bradley is in doesn't mean that Bradley is, you know, exclusively the problem. I don't think that that's the case, but I do think that he has probably been the weakest player on this team over the course of this split, and that's just not an ideal place from, you know, a team that's coming off of having so much pressure through the middle of the map. I think Bradley just needs to kind of get back into rhythm, back into the groove of it. He's been very successful at this level before, albeit in a different role in the top lane, but he can still be someone that I think is valuable here, and, you know, generally, I think hopefully he can grow into that, because right now, it's not working for me. It's not been nearly as strong as I would like it to be. Chime was also definitely worse in this series than he was earlier in the week. He has been pretty spectacular across this split so far, but this was not one of his better series. We talked about Sajed having a billion damage on AP Kaisa in Game 3, but he couldn't quite carry it. Shaden was really good on the Kindred in Game number 1, basically won them that first game by just team fighting really well in the back half, really good creative uses of the ultimate, but the Lee Sin and the Viega were both very underwhelming. Surdy wasn't able to dominate Tenacity in the way that this team kind of needed, and honestly, generally, the difficult to execute comp in games number 2 and 3, like, it just held them back. It made it a lot more difficult for them to be able to win this series, and so quite a few things to clean up for Fly, but this is a huge win for Disguise. This is something they're really going to be able to hang their hats on, and at this point, we've been talking about the league as a top 5. It very much has kind of been proven that it is a top 6. It is no longer a top 5. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3 and our final money match of the week here. It's CCG Esports taking on AOE Esports. And CCG is going to pick up the 2-1 series win, despite the roster changes here for AOE, with Cozy coming into the top lane, Onat coming into the mid lane, kind of returning here in the mid lane, if you will. AOE suffers basically the same identical fate that they have over the last couple of weeks. That's looking really bad in games 1 and 3, specifically game 3, and randomly winning game 2. And in this case, they very much randomly won game 2. It was a very close back and forth fun series with both teams kind of throwing leads as much as possible. Neither team looked particularly clean, but CCG definitely the better one to come out on top. Player of the series for me is going to go to Shochi in the mid lane. This is his best series of the split by a pretty considerable margin, in my opinion. I think both of their wins you could, pretty mostly attribute to him. I think game 1, obviously, Trevor's engages were spectacular, but you need someone to be able to follow up on those engages, and look at the team comp here for CCG in game 1. It's all about making sure Shochi is in the best possible position to carry the game. You've got an Ashe, you've got a Maokai, you've got a Cassante, like, it is all set up for Tristana to be able to take over, and Shochi did just that. So, credit to him in game 1, and then obviously the damage that he was able to output on Zeri in game number 3. Super, super, super massive. Very difficult to deal with. Onat, obviously, also going for those marksmen in the mid lane. I think Fearless definitely invites players to go for that a bit more in the NACL than we are seeing in other regions, but Zeri, Misfortune, Varus, they were all becoming relatively common here. We even saw the Akshan out of Onat. This is a bit of a takeaway. Shochi, a big Akshan player as well, and so, we saw some mind games, I would say, played in the mid lane matchup here, but Shochi's Zeri in game 3 is really what he's getting this player of the series for. An excellent series for him. Trevor definitely deserves a big shout out, though. I think he's been awesome this split. A lot of really major engages. He just plays the these champions so aggressively, and for the most part, he's able to get away with it because his timings are so good. The Rel in game 1 was awesome. Maybe not quite as good on the Alistair and the Braum, but golly, that Rel game was basically as perfect as you can play a Rel game. And Trevor, when he's on, like when he's winning, when he's able to get those, flanking gauges, like he is one of the better supports in the league at being able to do that. And so, very scary thing to end up running into. I think the rest of this team was still very good. Crimson is really starting to impress me as a top laner here. The inconsistencies just aren't there. Again, maybe I want to see a bit more game impact with the amount of resources he's able to generate for himself, but there's so many top laners that can't generate the resources that Crimson is generating in the top lane right now, so that's impressive. I think Manui is solid within the structure of this team. I think the only real issue I have with Manui is that I wish he was more of a takeover type of player, but it's just not really kind of the way that this team has wanted to play, at least at the start of this year. I think he's done fine in the role that he has been kind of gifted for them, and then Chad is solid. Like, he was definitely better than he was earlier this week. NXI had some problems in their losses, so credit to CCG. They continue to show that I am spot on in my analysis of them being clearly number 7 in the NACL. They're going to probably be significantly better than the bottom 3 and probably significantly worse than the top 6. They feel like a lock, in my opinion, to make the playoffs, to make top 8. I see a lot of people debating on whether or not they're going to be able to do that. I would be surprised if they didn't, just because they, were always probably going to beat teams like AOE and, Otter and Winthrop. I think that was always going to be on the menu at least a bit for them, but we'll have to see next week when they, or I guess 2 weeks from now, when they end up taking on Winthrop to see if they can make that prophecy a reality. And then for AOE, this team is who they are. Even with the roster changes, it's not going to completely change what this team is able to do. I do think that on paper, they should be better now. They should be more competitive. But again, like I said in the beginning, this is exactly who AOE was all split long. Like, this didn't really feel like a different team, even with new players in. Onat's going to get dud of the series here in the mid lane. I don't even think he really played all that poorly. He just was the one giving over the most amount of resources to CCG. His low mobility in game number 3 really ended up costing the team because gold was going on to him, and they weren't really able to utilize it all that well. I do want to give a big shout out to Wixie and Breezy. I think they were the best part of AOE in this series. Wixie in particular, I thought played really well across basically all 3 of these games. It just didn't really end up mattering in the end. And Breezy was also really solid, but NXI, really good in game 2. He pressed the R button and Brand did a billion damage, but the Nidalee, the Nunu, not looking nearly as good in the losses. And, Cozy, I think, had some solid moments, but I think it's just a tad bit too aggressive, and Crimson was definitely better in the top lane on the other side of this matchup. AOE was generally solid once again. They are a team that, while they can look interesting in a series, while they might be able to take a game number 2, they're just unable to actually close anything out and to win a series as a whole. They're sitting at 0-6, and they are in a prime position, unfortunately, to go down to the relegation tournament, and that's really just not an ideal place for them to be. I think they obviously had more expectations. Hopefully this roster can get a little bit more time to gel together and maybe things can start getting better, but time is running out for a team like AOE. For CCG, nice win. It's a money match. You ended up winning both your money matches, which is a really funny way for this to have gone, but overall, CCG is who we thought they were. They are a team that's probably going to be good enough to beat the bottom teams and maybe aren't going to be good enough to compete at the top, but that's probably enough to stay in the NACL. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in week number 5, and it's definitely a telling one, as we saw Winthrop University taking on Blue Otter, and Winthrop is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. This team continues to overperform and really impress me in terms of their ability to close out games. And it's kind of the opposite for Otter. I like this team, and I think that there is a lot to build off of, but they have a very clear weakness, and that is late game, like closing out games, being efficient in the back half. They are so adept at generating early leads. They are really good at being able to get their team in good situations and get themselves advantages, and they just don't really capitalize on those advantages nearly as well as a lot of the other teams in the league right now. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that this is a relatively inexperienced team for this level. 3 of the 5, yes, have had experience in the NACL before, but it's limited. Quacker's really the only one with extensive experience. And the 2 players that you're lacking that NACL experience in are probably the 2 that need to step up in the late game the most, in Samikin and Levitate. And so you're really hoping that you can start to, iron out some of those issues, but it really came back to bite them in this series, especially in game 1. But Winthrop was there to take advantage of it. A really clean series from them. Player of the series for me is going to go to Aaron down in the bot lane. I've been impressed with Aaron. I've always been impressed with Aaron. We talked about this kind of like core team for Winthrop last split, or not Winthrop, for Wildcard. Last split of Winnie, Darkwings, Aaron, that were kind of, really starting to build something together, and Aaron was the one that I was really impressed by. He was the one that I continued to hype up on this channel, and that has carried over a lot into summer. I think he has been one of the better, like, middle table AD carries, I should say, in the league. I almost forgot what position he played because I'm having a stroke, I guess. I don't know. Aaron was really good, though, in this series, and he's been good across a lot of this split. I think specifically the Zeri in Game 2 is what I and a lot of other people are going to notice first, but he was generally just good in both games, and that's really important to see. I think Darkwings continues to look really good. Some of those scatter the weeks on Syndra in game number 1 were truly, truly telling. Like, they were, you know, game-defining. So really happy to see Darkwings do well. Denethor was back in the lineup here. He was awesome on the Cassante in game number 2. Winnie looked really consistent on the Morgana. Skytech's Taric really looked solid. I think that champion looked very good in the NACL this week, and generally it's looked good in other regions as well when it's been pulled out. Maybe Taric is kind of a sleeper great pick right now. Maybe expect to see that rise in popularity if teams start to pick up on that, but overall, it was just a really good win for Winthrop. They get themselves to 500, maybe not in terms of game score, but in terms of series score, which is more important, of course, and, you know, maybe I've underrated, you know, Winthrop across this year. Maybe they are number 7. Maybe they are closer to being in that top 6 than a team like CCG, but at least for now, it's definitely looking like they are a top 8 team, and that's really what they want to be. And for Otter, you know, unfortunately, there are a lot of good teams in the NACL, and I'm a little bit worried about them at the moment. Dropping to 1-5 is certainly not the best position in the world to be in. That does put you in the bottom 2 in terms of the standings, and remember, that's really the only place where you can't land. You got to be somewhere better than that. And their inconsistencies in the late game are just problematic for them at the moment. Dud of the series could go a couple of different directions. I'm going to go with Music. You know, I don't think Music was horrible here. I thought that there were some tempo, you know, plays that were really good. I thought his early tempo in game 1 on the Sejuani was actually really solid. It's just the consistency of playing those frontline engagers, those facilitators in the late game that he has just struggled on over the course of this split. Hopefully he can get better at that. I think Rovex's engages were sometimes a little off on the Nautilus in game number 2. You know, maybe you want to see a bit more out of Quacker, who is not really been all that good over the past couple of weeks, as I've highlighted on this channel. You know, Samikin and Levitate are doing their best to try and carry these games in terms of the damage they offer, but like I said, they're the least, you know, experienced players on this team, and they're being asked to have the biggest role. It's just not really an ideal situation for Otter at the current moment, and their record is kind of showing that. They're not out by any means. There is a lot of things that they can do at the bottom of the standings to keep themselves alive, but they've got to start stepping it up soon, because, you know, the later we get into the season, the more alarming these problems start to become. But this is a really nice win for Winthrop. They've already beaten a couple of really great teams at this level. They have continued to, you know, just show that they deserve to be ranked really highly, and honestly, at this point, I can no longer deny them. This is a very, very good team. Alright, but that is going to do it for my NACL Week 5 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. Up on the screen now, the updated standings after 5 weeks of action. No ties technically here in the NACL, as everybody at least has different game scores, even if they have the same series score. That's not reflected on Leaguepedia. I still don't understand why. This is how things will be calculated for playoffs, and so this is how I will represent them on this graphic. But a lot of fun things to talk about just in general. Of course, every team is listed here, but on the right for every single team, you can see a couple of things. First, power rank. That's where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10 in my power rankings, and changes how that has changed from last week to this week. Again, notably, not a lot of changes. I really just feel bad. Like, I feel weird about making major changes to the power rankings right now because there are so many good teams. Nobody really deserves to move down in the power rankings right now. Even the teams that did lose and kind of struggle this week, like, am I expecting that to continue? Like, FlyQuest is going to stay at number 2 for me in the power rankings, because do I think that they're not going to be a top 2 team? I think they are going to be a top 2 team, even if they are struggling right now. Like, did Disguised have a really good week? Did they beat FlyQuest? Did they look really good? Yes, but do I trust this team more than the other teams above them that have proven over multiple weeks that they can perform at the level that DSG is performing at right now? Probably not, and so things just are going to stay until proven otherwise. I have not been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that any of these teams are any different than what they were ranked as last week, and I just don't think that that is the case, and so they're going to stay the same, except for Winthrop jumping up to 8, Otter jumping down to 9. This feels pretty obvious. Winthrop is clearly better than Otter right now. Otter, unfortunately, clearly is number 9 for me. Hell, Winthrop could be number 7, and CCG could be number 8. I think that's a pretty realistic way to look at it, but bottom 2, at least in terms of my expectations at the moment, are definitely Otter and AOE. I think both of these teams have enough talent to be able to get themselves out of it. Otter is only 1 game behind. You know, AOE will take a tad bit more in order to get them into the right spot, but there is a lot of time left for them to be able to work through it. Like, you've got a couple of weeks of the regular season. You just have to start winning now. You got to clean up your issues, as I've talked about. But, you know, that's the only actual change that's going to be made on the power rankings here. So let me know if you guys agree or disagree with that down in the comments. Do you think either team, you know, deserves to move up more, like Winthrop? Do they deserve to be higher? Let me know. I'm curious down in the comments how you guys feel about that. But let's get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 5. My player of the week shouldn't be a shock after how I talked about this player over the course of these games. It's going to go to Tomo, the AD carry for DSG. He is the first player in the NACL to get player of the week twice in this split. He got it in week 2. He's getting it once again here in week 5. He has been exceptional. He is right up there, in my opinion, with UG for most valuable prospect, if you can still give him that award. Obviously, as somebody who's spent a considerable amount of time in the LCS, he has been phenomenal this split. He has been everything DSG brought him in to be, and then some. Truly the carry, if you will, for a team that was desperately looking for that in the spring split. So they're happy to have Tomo. My honorable mentions, my runners-up this week, Yuji, the jungler for Dragonsteel, the other player he's kind of duking out, best player in the league for, at least at the current moment. Tomo and Yuji, in my opinion, have been the two most valuable players to their individual teams so far this split. Yuji, obviously, at the top of the standings, though, which definitely gives him a bit of the edge. He was awesome this week once again. You could theoretically throw Scary Jerry here. You could throw Zyko here. All of them were excellent. Dragonsteel just looked really good in their series. And then Faisal, the top laner for Supernova. I really do think he's reclaiming his spot as one of, if not the best top laner in the NACL right now. He is dominating a lot of the matchups he's in, and he's showing his, you know, kind of difference-making ability to actually play outside lanes and to be a really good late-game macro player that, honestly, he has a better grasp of than basically every other top laner at this level. It's really impressive to see, and, you know, Faisal's one of those players that I think will make a very good pro if any team ever decides to actually pick him up. He is somebody that I really expect to make that transition well. So those are my runners-up. My player of the week is Tomo, but my dud of the week is unfortunately going to go to Music. Otter is really struggling right now. A lot of things are going wrong for this team. Of course, they're on a pretty big losing streak, but I think they can turn it around. Unfortunately, Music really struggled to be able to play out the mid to late game this week, and that's been a big problem for Otter in general. I think as a team, this is more of like a team-wide problem than it is one individual player having an issue, but Music was the one that kind of exemplified it, I would say, over the course of this week. Hopefully they can figure things out, but Music is going to get my dud of the week, and Tomo is going to get my player of the week here for week number 5, and that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Leave a like on this video if you did enjoy it. It means a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content. And it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the NACL on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions every single week as well. That's the LCS, LEC, LCK, and LPL. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.